In the southern reaches of Arabia, where the land rose into highlands that caught the seasonal rains and channeled them into valleys of extraordinary fertility, there flourished a kingdom that the ancient world regarded with a mixture of envy and wonder. The Greeks would later call it Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia, distinguishing it from the barren deserts to the north, acknowledging that here, in this corner of the earth, nature had bestowed gifts that seemed almost excessive in their abundance. The people who lived there called their kingdom Sheba, and from its terraced hillsides and irrigated plains, they had built a civilization that traded with the edges of the known world. The wealth of Sheba was rooted in the soil itself, in groves of stunted, unimpressive-looking trees that produced something more valuable than gold. Frankincense and myrrh, these were the treasures that caravans carried northward across hundreds of miles of desert, bound for the temples and palaces of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the lands beyond. The resins that bled from these trees when their bark was cut became the incense that rose before the altars of countless gods, the perfumes that adorned the bodies of kings and queens, the embalming agents that preserved the dead for their journey into eternity. No religious ceremony of significance was complete without the fragrant smoke of Arabian incense, and Sheba controlled the source. The Sabaeans had transformed this natural advantage into an empire of commerce. Their caravans were legendary, great trains of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, laden with aromatics and spices, moving along routes that their ancestors had established centuries before. They had built way stations and trading posts at intervals across the desert, had negotiated arrangements with the tribes whose territories they crossed, had developed systems of credit and exchange that allowed transactions to span the vast distances between producer and consumer. The merchants of Sheba were as sophisticated as any in the ancient world, their commercial networks extending from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, their ships sailing to African shores, and their agents operating in markets from Memphis to Babylon. The capital city of this mercantile kingdom rose in the highlands, its buildings constructed from the same stone that formed the mountains around it, its temples and palaces reflecting the wealth that poured through its gates with every arriving caravan. The great dam at Marib, an engineering marvel that would stand for over 1,000 years, captured the seasonal floods and distributed their waters through an elaborate system of channels and reservoirs, turning what might have been a modest settlement into a city that could support tens of thousands of inhabitants. Gardens flourished where gardens had no natural right to exist. Palm trees lined streets that would otherwise have been dusty and bare. The ingenuity that had made Sheba wealthy and commerce had also made it green in a land where green was precious. It was here, in this kingdom of incense and irrigation, of caravans and calculated risks, that a woman ruled whose name would echo through millennia of religious memory. Scripture does not give us her personal name. She is known simply as the Queen of Sheba, or in other traditions as Makeda or Bilqis, but it gives us something more important, a portrait of her character, revealed through her actions, that has made her a symbol of the sincere search for truth across countless generations of interpretation. She was, by all accounts, extraordinary. To rule Sheba as a woman in the ancient Near East was itself remarkable, suggesting either a culture more flexible in its gender expectations than many of its neighbours, or personal qualities so exceptional that they overcame whatever resistance tradition might have posed. She had inherited, or perhaps had claimed, a throne that required not merely ceremonial presence, but active engagement with the complex realities of international commerce and regional politics. The caravans that made Sheba wealthy were targets for raiders, their routes subject to the whims of tribal chiefs who could close passages or demand ruinous fees. The markets that purchased Sabaean goods were themselves subject to the rise and fall of empires, their purchasing power dependent on political stability that no merchant could control. To rule such a kingdom required intelligence, judgment, and a capacity for strategic thinking that many rulers of either gender would have found beyond their abilities. But the queen possessed more than administrative competence. She was curious, genuinely, deeply curious about the world beyond her borders and the truths that might be found there. Sheba was not intellectually isolated. The same trade routes that carried incense northward brought information southward, stories and ideas from cultures across the ancient world. Merchants who had visited Egyptian temples described their rituals. Travellers who had passed through Babylonian cities spoke of their astronomical observations. Scribes who had copied documents in foreign courts shared what they had learned of other people's laws and customs. The Queen listened to all of it, sifting through the reports for whatever wisdom they might contain, building in her mind a picture of a world far larger and more complex than her own considerable kingdom. Yet the more she learned, the more questions multiplied. The gods of Egypt were not the gods of Babylon, and neither were the gods that her own people worshipped in the temples of Sheba. The wise men of one culture contradicted the wise men of another. The certainties proclaimed in one court were dismissed as foolishness in the next. How was a thinking person to navigate this chaos of competing claims? Was there truth beneath the contradictions, some foundation of wisdom that could bear the weight of genuine understanding? Or was all human knowledge merely local opinion dressed in the garments of universal principle? These were not idle philosophical puzzles for the Queen. She ruled a people who looked to her for guidance not only in matters of commerce and diplomacy, but in questions of meaning and value. What should Sheba believe? What practices should its temples maintain? What principles should govern its courts and its dealings with other nations? The Queen could not simply defer these questions to her priests, who had their own traditions and their own interests. She needed to understand for herself, to find, if possible, a wisdom worthy of the name, a truth that would remain true, regardless of where one happened to be standing when one encountered it. It was into this context of searching that the reports about Solomon began to arrive. The name was not unknown in Sheba. Israel was a trading partner, a kingdom that had emerged from tribal confederation into genuine statehood under kings named Saul and David. The Israelites controlled territory that mattered commercially, land bridges between Egypt and Mesopotamia, ports that accessed the Mediterranean trade. Sabaean merchants who dealt in the northern markets would have encountered Israelite traders, would have heard something of their peculiar religion, with its insistence on a single god, its prohibition of images, its elaborate system of sacrifices and festivals. It was interesting, certainly, different enough from the polytheistic norm to attract attention, but not necessarily more compelling than other local variations on ancient Near Eastern religion. What changed was the accession of David's son to the throne, and the reports that began filtering southward about what kind of ruler he was proving to be. Solomon, they said, was not merely competent or even excellent. He was something unprecedented, a king whose wisdom exceeded that of all the wise men of the East and all the sages of Egypt. He had composed thousands of proverbs. He had written songs by the hundreds. He could speak with authority about botany, from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grew from walls. He could discourse on zoology, on the behaviour of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. His understanding seemed to encompass the entire natural world and to extend beyond it into matters of human nature, justice, and the proper ordering of society. The reports grew more detailed as the years passed. Solomon had built a temple to his god that surpassed anything in the region for beauty and craftsmanship. He had constructed a palace complex that took 13 years to complete, with a hall of justice where he rendered verdicts of such insight that the entire nation stood in awe of him. Foreign dignitaries came from distant lands simply to hear him speak, to pose their most difficult questions and receive answers that satisfied both mind and heart. The Egyptian pharaoh had given him a daughter in marriage, an extraordinary honour that Egypt extended to almost no foreign ruler. The king of Tyre had entered into treaties with him and supplied the materials for his ambitious building projects. Solomon, it seemed, had become the centre of gravity in the ancient Near East, the point toward which wisdom seekers from every direction were drawn. The Queen found herself returning to these reports again and again, weighing them against her natural skepticism, testing their plausibility against her experience of how the world actually worked. Surely there was exaggeration in what the merchants said. Surely the stories had grown in the telling, as stories always did. No human being could actually know everything, could answer every question, could possess wisdom that transcended the limitations of ordinary mortality. The reports must be at least partially legendary, the kind of idealizing narrative that gathered around successful kings like barnacles on a ship's hull. And yet, the reports came from multiple sources, from traders who had no particular reason to embellish, from travellers who had actually visited Jerusalem and seen Solomon's court with their own eyes. The details were specific in ways that legend usually avoided. Precise descriptions of the temple's dimensions, exact accounts of the administrative structures Solomon had established, particular examples of judgments he had rendered. If this was mythology, it was mythology of an unusually grounded variety. If it was exaggeration, the exaggeration had roots in something real. More troubling to the Queen's skepticism was the consistency of what the reports claimed about the source of Solomon's wisdom. He did not attribute his understanding to his own brilliance, did not claim it as a human achievement earned through study and effort. He credited everything to his God, the God of Israel, the one whose temple now stood on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, the deity who had appeared to Solomon in a dream and offered him whatever he wished. Solomon had asked not for wealth or military victory or long life, but for wisdom to govern his people justly. And this God, according to the story, had granted the request with an abundance that exceeded anything Solomon himself had imagined. This was what drew the Queen's attention most intensely. If Solomon's wisdom was merely human wisdom, superior perhaps, exceptional certainly, but still operating within the normal range of human capacity, then it might be admired without requiring anything of those who heard about it. But if his wisdom was divine gift, if it flowed from a source that transcended the merely human, then encountering it might change not just what one knew, but who one was. The Queen was not afraid of such change. She was, in fact, hungry for it. The questions that kept her awake at night, the uncertainties that gnawed at her sense of what her life and her reign actually meant. If there was a wisdom that could address these things, she wanted to find it. If there was a God who actually answered when humans asked, she wanted to know. The decision formed slowly, over weeks and months of reflection, but when it crystallized, it was absolute. She would go herself to Jerusalem. She would not send ambassadors or representatives, would not trust second-hand reports when first-hand encounter was possible. She would travel the hundreds of miles that separated Sheba from Solomon's kingdom. She would bring questions, the hardest questions she could formulate, the riddles that her own wise men could not solve, the philosophical puzzles that had resisted every attempt at resolution. She would test this king's wisdom personally, would see for herself whether the reports were true, or whether they dissolved upon closer examination like morning mist in the desert sun. Her advisors would object. The journey was dangerous, expensive, unbecoming of a queen who should remain in her capital, exercising sovereign authority. She would be gone for months, leaving her kingdom in the hands of regents whose loyalty could not be perfectly guaranteed. And for what? To satisfy curiosity, to pursue philosophical questions that practical rulers had no business asking. The objections were predictable, and the Queen was prepared to overrule them. This was not curiosity for its own sake. This was the most important question she had ever asked. Was there truth in the world that was actually true? Was there wisdom that could bear the weight of a life devoted to finding it? The preparations would begin immediately. If Solomon's wisdom was real, it deserved the most serious engagement she could offer. And if it was not, if the reports proved to be the exaggeration she half suspected, then at least she would know. At least she would have looked for truth in the most promising place the world had to offer, and found it wanting. Either way, the journey would be worth making. Either way, the question demanded an answer. A queen in a land of wealth and wonder had heard rumours of something greater than wealth, and more wonderful than wonder, and she had decided to see for herself whether those rumours spoke the truth. The announcement sent ripples through the Sabaean court that took weeks to fully subside. The Queen had called her advisors to the Great Hall, the ministers who managed the kingdom's trade, the generals who commanded its defences, the priests who tended its temples, the scholars who preserved its learning, and informed them of her intention. She would journey to Jerusalem. She would meet Solomon face to face. She would be gone for the better part of a year, accounting for the travel in both directions and whatever time the visit itself might require. The kingdom would need to function in her absence, and she expected them to ensure that it did. The objections came immediately, as she had known they would. Her chief minister, a man whose grey beard testified to decades of service under her father and herself, spoke first. The risks were substantial, he argued. The trade routes that connected Sheba to the northern kingdoms were not uniformly safe. bandits operated in the less patrolled stretches. Tribal chiefs whose cooperation could not be guaranteed controlled crucial passages. The desert itself was an enemy. Heat that could kill in hours, sandstorms that could bury entire caravans, water sources that sometimes failed when they were needed most. These dangers were manageable for merchant expeditions that travelled light and fast, but a royal caravan moving at ceremonial pace would be vulnerable in ways that ordinary traders were not. Beyond the physical dangers lay political considerations. What message would the Queen's departure send to rival powers who watched Saba's strength with calculating eyes? Would it appear as weakness, an opportunity for neighbouring kingdoms to test boundaries that had been stable for years? And what of the internal dynamics of the court itself? A regent, however loyal, would accumulate power during a long absence. Relationships would shift, alliances would realign. The Queen might return to find her kingdom subtly changed in ways that could not easily be reversed. The Queen listened to all of it, her face revealing nothing of her inner response. She had anticipated every argument, had weighed each consideration in the months of reflection that preceded her announcement. When the minister finished, she turned to the others, inviting them to add whatever concerns they might have. The high priest wondered about the religious implications. Was it appropriate for Saba's queen to seek wisdom from a foreign god, to treat an Israelite king's understanding as superior to what her own traditions provided? A younger advisor, more pragmatic than pious, questioned the expense. A royal expedition of the magnitude required would drain treasury reserves that might be needed for more pressing purposes. Another worried about the precedent. If the Queen travelled to Jerusalem this year, where might she be expected to travel next year? Would every foreign king who cultivated a reputation for wisdom expect a personal visit? The scholars, when their turn came, offered a different perspective. They had studied the reports from Jerusalem with professional interest, had compared them to what was known of wisdom traditions in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Solomon's reputation, they acknowledged, was not easily dismissed. The Israelites had produced a body of literature, proverbs, songs, philosophical reflections, that bore examination on its own merits. If even a portion of what was attributed to their king was genuine, then he represented something worth investigating. The scholars stopped short of endorsing the journey, but their testimony complicated the narrative of foolish risk that the other advisors had constructed. When everyone had spoken, the Queen responded. She understood the concerns, she said. She'd considered them carefully before reaching her decision, but certain questions could not be answered from a distance. Certain truths could not be evaluated through intermediaries. She was not abandoning her kingdom or neglecting her responsibilities. She was pursuing the most important responsibility any ruler bore, the responsibility to understand what was actually true about the world and to govern accordingly. If Solomon's wisdom was what the reports claimed, then encountering it might transform her capacity to lead. If it was not, then she would have tested the most celebrated claim of the age and found it wanting. Either outcome justified the cost and the risk. Her decision was final. What remained was preparation. The weeks that followed transformed the palace into a staging ground for the most elaborate expedition Saba had mounted in living memory. The Queen had determined that her arrival in Jerusalem would communicate respect for Solomon's achievement and confidence in her own kingdom's standing. She would not appear as a supplicant seeking favours or a provincial ruler awed by cosmopolitan sophistication. She would appear as what she was, the sovereign of a wealthy and cultured nation, coming as an equal to meet an equal, bearing gifts worthy of the occasion and questions worthy of the recipient. The gifts required the most careful consideration. What did one bring to a king who reportedly possessed wealth beyond measure, whose palace was overlaid with gold and whose throne was flanked by carved lions plated in precious metal? The ordinary currency of diplomatic exchange, silver and gold in standard weights, would be received politely but would make no impression. The Queen needed to offer something that would communicate the unique character of her kingdom, something that Solomon could not easily obtain elsewhere, something that would establish from the first moment that Saba was no ordinary realm. Spices, then. The aromatics that formed the foundation of Sabaean commerce would form the foundation of her tribute as well. But not the ordinary grades that merchants sold in foreign markets, the finest frankincense from the most carefully tended groves, resins so pure that their fragrance seemed to bypass the nose entirely and enter directly into the soul. Myrrh of such quality that Solomon's priest would recognize immediately what they were being offered. And the rarer spices that Sheba imported from even more distant lands, cinnamon and cassia, their sources shrouded in deliberate mystery, their prices elevated by the carefully cultivated ignorance of those who purchased them. The queen ordered quantities that would have represented a year's income for a wealthy merchant, packed in containers of carved alabaster that were themselves works of art. Gold came next, not because Solomon lacked gold, but because the form mattered as much as the substance. Sabaean craftsmen had developed techniques for working precious metals that produced effects other cultures could not replicate. The queen commissioned pieces that would demonstrate this mastery, vessels whose surfaces seemed to flow like water, jewellery whose intricacy revealed new details the longer one examined it, decorative objects that combined gold with precious stones in patterns that suggested mathematical principles the artists themselves could not have articulated. 120 talents of gold, the chroniclers would later record, an almost inconceivable quantity, enough to finance a small kingdom's operations for years. But the queen was not thinking in terms of finance, she was thinking in terms of statement. Solomon would understand immediately that this visitor warranted his full attention. The precious stones required their own selection process. Sheba's position at the crossroads of trade routes meant that gems from multiple sources passed through its markets: emeralds and sapphires, rubies and pearls, stones whose names varied by region but whose beauty was universally recognized. The queen's jewelers sorted through the royal collections and the offerings of merchants who sensed an opportunity, selecting specimens of unusual size, exceptional clarity, and rare coloration. These too were packed with care, cushioned against the jolting of camel travel, protected from the dust that infiltrated everything in desert crossings. But the gifts were only the most visible part of the preparation. The queen also assembled the human components of her expedition with equal care. She would need guards, certainly, soldiers capable of protecting the caravan from whatever threats might materialize along the route. She selected veterans whose experience included desert operations, men who knew how to read terrain and weather, who could recognize the signs of ambush before it was sprung, who would remain alert through the monotonous days when danger seemed remote and strike without hesitation when it suddenly appeared. She would need servants to manage the practical logistics of moving a royal household across 1,000 miles of challenging terrain. These were not the ornamental attendants who served in palace ceremonies, but practical workers who knew how to pitch tents in high winds, prepare meals with limited resources, care for animals under harsh conditions, and solve the countless small problems that travel inevitably generated. The Queen interviewed candidates personally, looking for competence and resilience, dismissing those whose skills were limited to the comfortable routines of court life. She would need musicians and entertainers, not for her own diversion, though that would be welcome during the long weeks of travel, but because a royal expedition without cultural accompaniment would appear impoverished, a failure of imagination that would undermine the impression she intended to create. Sabaean music was distinctive, its scales and rhythms different from what Solomon's court would have encountered, its instruments capable of producing sounds that would intrigue sophisticated listeners. The Queen selected performers who could represent this tradition at its best, who could hold their own in a court that probably included the finest musicians from across the ancient Near East. She would need scribes to record what transpired, the conversations with Solomon, the observations about his kingdom, the answers he provided to the questions she would bring. Memory was unreliable, especially for the kind of detailed philosophical exchanges the Queen anticipated. She wanted documentation that would allow her to review Solomon's words long after the visit ended, to share them with her own scholars, to incorporate whatever wisdom she gained into the governance of her kingdom. The scribes she selected were trained in multiple languages, capable of capturing nuance as well as content, experienced in producing records that would remain intelligible years after they were written. And she would need advisors, not the full complement of ministers who managed Sheba in her absence, but a smaller group who could help her navigate the complexities of a foreign court, who could observe what she might miss, who could provide counsel when she faced decisions that required perspectives beyond her own. She chose carefully, balancing expertise against flexibility, selecting people who could adapt to unfamiliar circumstances without losing their capacity for independent judgment. The questions she would bring occupied her most intensely during these weeks of preparation. The Queen spent hours in her private chambers, sometimes alone and sometimes with her scholars, formulating the challenges she would present to Solomon. These were not trivial riddles designed to entertain, though the tradition of testing wisdom through riddles was ancient and respected, but genuine puzzles that had resisted solution, paradoxes that seemed to admit no resolution, dilemmas that forced choices between values that both seemed essential. She crafted questions about justice. How could a ruler punish the guilty without harming the innocent who depended on them? How could law be both firm and merciful, both predictable and responsive to individual circumstances? She crafted questions about knowledge. How could anyone be certain that what seemed true was actually true? How could wisdom be distinguished from cleverness, genuine understanding from sophisticated confusion? She crafted questions about the divine. If the gods existed, why did they permit suffering? If they were good, why was the world so often cruel? If they were powerful, why did evil so frequently triumph? These were the questions that had driven her toward Jerusalem in the first place, and she was determined to present them with precision. She wrote them out, revised them, discussed them with her scholars, refined them further. If Solomon's wisdom was real, it would be revealed in his engagement with these hard problems. If it was mere reputation, inflated by admirers and unchallenged by serious examination, then these questions would expose the emptiness beneath the surface. The preparations stretched across weeks, then months. The date of departure was set, postponed when unexpected complications arose, reset when those complications resolved. The Queen found herself experiencing an unfamiliar mixture of emotions as the day approached: anticipation and anxiety, confidence and doubt, the excitement of embarking on an adventure, and the fear that the adventure might prove disappointing. She had committed herself so fully to this journey, had invested so much in the hope that Solomon's wisdom might answer her deepest questions, that the possibility of finding nothing left her more vulnerable than she liked to acknowledge. On the morning of departure, the caravan assembled outside the city gates in the grey light that preceded dawn. Hundreds of camels knelt in patient rows, their burdens secured, their drivers performing final checks on harnesses and loads. The guards had already sent scouts ahead to verify the first day's route. The servants had packed the Queen's travelling tent with everything she would need for months away from her palace. The musicians tuned their instruments, the scribes organised their writing materials, the advisors gathered in a cluster, speaking quietly among themselves about what lay ahead. The Queen emerged from the city in a litter carried by matched bearers, her formal attire signalling the ceremonial importance of the moment, even as practical travelling clothes waited in her baggage for the days ahead. She passed along the length of the caravan, acknowledging the bows of servants and soldiers, receiving the good wishes of the officials who would manage her kingdom in her absence. At the head of the column, she paused, looking northward toward the desert that separated Saba from all that lay beyond it. Somewhere beyond that desert, beyond the mountains and valleys and hundreds of miles of ancient road, a king sat on a throne whose fame had spread to the edges of the known world. Somewhere beyond the horizon she now faced, answers might wait for the questions that had consumed her. Somewhere in the direction she was about to travel, truth might exist that was actually true. The Queen gave the signal. The caravan lurched into motion, camels rising in their ungainly way, drivers calling out in the rhythmic chants that would pace the journey ahead. The expedition that would enter history had begun, a river of wealth and curiosity flowing northward through the morning light, carrying a queen toward an encounter that would change her understanding of everything. The desert waited, the questions waited, and Solomon, not yet knowing she was coming, continued to dispense the wisdom that had drawn her from the ends of the earth. The rhythm of the journey established itself within the first few days, a pattern that would govern the weeks ahead with the inexorable regularity of tides or seasons. The caravan rose before dawn, when the air still held the memory of night's coolness, and the stars had not yet faded from the western sky. Servants dismantled tents with practiced efficiency, while drivers checked their animals and loads. By the time the sun crested the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, the column was already moving, stretching across the landscape like a great serpent winding its way toward destinations it could not see. The days divided themselves into natural segments. The morning hours were for serious travel, covering as much ground as possible before the heat became oppressive. The Queen sometimes rode in her litter during these hours, cushioned against the swaying motion of the bearer's steps, reviewing the questions she had prepared, or simply watching the landscape scroll past the gauze curtains that filtered the growing light. Other times she chose to ride a camel herself, preferring the elevated vantage point and the direct contact with the journey's reality over the insulated comfort of the litter. Her guards had objected to this initially. A queen exposed on camelback was more vulnerable than a queen concealed in a covered conveyance, but she had overruled them. She had not undertaken this journey to experience it from behind curtains. The midday hours brought rest, the caravan halting in whatever shade the terrain provided, tents erected to shelter the Queen and her advisors from the sun that hammered down with physical force. These were hours for sleeping, for the quiet conversation that heat made preferable to activity, for the simple maintenance of bodies and beasts that the desert required. Water was distributed carefully, measured out by servants who understood that the margin between sufficiency and shortage was thinner than most travellers realised. The camels, those remarkable creatures whose capacity for endurance made desert travel possible, knelt in patient clusters, their eyes half closed, their bodies metabolizing reserves that would be replenished at the next oasis. The afternoon brought renewed movement, slower than the morning's pace, continuing until the sun approached the horizon and the light softened toward evening. Then the caravan halted for the night, the tents rising again, the cooking fires kindled, the musicians unpacking their instruments for the entertainment that made the expedition's evenings bearable. The Queen dined with her advisors under canopies of woven fabric, discussing the day's progress, reviewing what lay ahead, occasionally returning to the questions she would eventually pose to Solomon. The conversations were unhurried, expansive in the way that travel conversations often became, freed from the pressing schedules that governed life in the capital. And then night, the desert revealing its other face, cold where the day had been hot, silent where the day had been filled with the sounds of movement, dark except for the stars, that blazed overhead with an intensity that city dwellers never witnessed. The Queen often walked outside her tent during these hours, wrapped in robes against the chill, gazing upward at the same constellations that her ancestors had navigated by for generations beyond counting. The stars asked no questions and offered no answers, but their constancy was its own form of comfort. Whatever else might change, whatever uncertainties the journey held, the stars would continue their ancient circuits, indifferent to human searching but faithful in their patterns. The route the caravan followed was not a single road, but a network of paths that generations of traders had worn into the landscape. The Queen's guides knew these paths intimately, knew which valleys offered passage through mountain ranges, which wadis held water after the seasonal rains, which territories required tribute to local chiefs, and which could be traversed without negotiation. They adjusted the route daily based on intelligence gathered from travellers moving in the opposite direction, from the scouts who rode ahead to verify conditions, from their own reading of weather and terrain. The journey was not a straight line, but a series of calculations, each day's path determined by factors that shifted constantly. The landscape itself transformed as the caravan moved northward. The highlands of Sheba gave way to lower elevations, the careful irrigation of home territory, replaced by the unmediated harshness of true desert. Sand stretched to the horizon in some regions, great seas of golden grains that the wind shaped into dunes of haunting beauty. In other areas, the ground was hard-packed earth, scattered with rocks that ranged from pebbles to boulders, the occasional acacia tree providing the only vertical element in an otherwise horizontal world. Mountains appeared in the distance, were approached over days of travel, were traversed through passes that earlier travellers had discovered, and then receded behind as new mountains appeared ahead. The Queen found herself entering a state of mind that the journey seemed to cultivate almost deliberately. The concerns that had pressed so urgently in her palace, the daily decisions, the political calculations, the constant demands of governance, faded into a kind of background noise, present but no longer dominant. In their place arose a spaciousness, an openness to reflection that her ordinary life rarely permitted. She thought about her kingdom and what she hoped to bring back to it. She thought about Solomon and what she expected to find when she reached him. She thought about the questions she carried and whether any wisdom, however profound, could truly answer them. She thought too about truth itself, what it was, how it could be recognized, why it mattered so desperately to her. The religions she knew made claims about truth, but their claims contradicted one another. The philosophers she had studied offered frameworks for understanding, but their frameworks rested on assumptions that other philosophers rejected. Even within her own court, her advisors disagreed about fundamental matters, each certain of positions that the others found untenable. How was clarity possible in such a world? How could anyone find solid ground when the ground itself seemed to shift depending on where one stood? The merchants they encountered along the way offered their own perspectives, though they rarely framed them in philosophical terms. These were practical men, concerned with prices and routes and the reliability of trading partners, but their experience had taught them things that scholars sometimes missed. They knew that some sources could be trusted and others could not. They knew that reputation, built over years of consistent dealing, was more valuable than any single transaction. They knew that the world, for all its complexity, operated according to patterns that patient observation could discern. The Queen listened to them during the evening hours when the caravan camped near other travellers, finding in their hard-won pragmatism a kind of wisdom that complemented the more abstract formulations of her scholars. Word of her expedition travelled ahead of her, carried by the informal networks that connected trading communities across the ancient Near East. By the time the caravan crossed into territories that bordered Israel, the Queen's coming was already known, already discussed, already generating the speculation that royal visits inevitably attracted. Who was this Queen from the distant south? Why was she travelling so far from her own kingdom? What did she want from Solomon, and what was she prepared to offer in return? The questions multiplied as the caravan drew closer to its destination, each community adding its own theories to the growing body of rumour. The Queen was aware of this attention without being troubled by it. Let them speculate. Let the stories of her coming reach Jerusalem before she did. Solomon would have time to prepare for her arrival, to anticipate the encounter, to consider how he wished to receive a visitor whose journey demonstrated either remarkable wisdom or remarkable foolishness, depending on what she found at its end. The reports that had drawn her from Saba would be tested now, and if Solomon was indeed what those reports claimed, he would welcome the testing. If he was not, then better to discover that truth sooner rather than later. The weeks accumulated into months. The caravan passed through territories whose names the Queen had known only from merchants' reports, lands where different languages were spoken, different gods worshipped, different customs observed. She noted the variations with the careful attention of a ruler who understood that her own kingdom was one small part of a much larger world. The people she encountered were not so different from her own subjects, despite the surface variations. They worked and loved and worried, and hoped, just as the Sabians did. They sought security for their families and meaning for their lives, just as humans everywhere sought these things. The diversity of the world concealed an underlying unity that the journey was helping her to see. As they approached the borders of Israel, the terrain began to shift again. The endless desert gave way to more varied landscape, hills that promised the presence of water, vegetation that suggested rainfall sufficient for agriculture, signs of permanent settlement that the deep desert never displayed. The caravans they encountered were more frequent now, the traffic of commerce that flowed through Solomon's kingdom, leaving its mark on the roads themselves. The Queen sensed that she was entering a different kind of place, a kingdom where order had been imposed on the chaos that characterized less organized territories. The reports from her scouts confirmed what her senses suggested. Jerusalem lay only days ahead now, visible from certain high points as a distant cluster on its ridge, the smoke of its cooking fires and its temple sacrifices rising into the sky like a beacon. The city that contained Solomon, the temple that housed his god, the throne room where her questions would finally receive their answers, all of it waited just beyond the horizon, close enough now to generate a new kind of anticipation in the Queen's heart. She had travelled for months. She had crossed territories that most people would never see. She had endured the hardships of the desert and the uncertainties of the road. And through all of it, she'd carried her questions like precious cargo, protecting them from the elements, refining them during the long hours of travel, preparing them for the moment when they would finally be spoken aloud to the one man in the world who might be able to answer them. That moment was almost here. The journey was almost complete. The testing was about to begin. The Queen ordered her servants to prepare her finest garments, to polish the containers that held her gifts, to ensure that every element of her arrival would communicate the seriousness of her purpose. She'd come too far to appear as anything less than what she was, a seeker of truth who had crossed the world to find it, a queen who had risked her kingdom's stability for the chance to encounter genuine wisdom, a woman who believed that some questions were worth any cost to answer. Jerusalem rose before her, white and gold in the afternoon light, its walls promising secrets that she had travelled 1,000 miles to learn. The Queen of Sheba had arrived at the threshold of her destination. What she would find beyond that threshold remained to be seen. The approach to Jerusalem exceeded anything the Queen had imagined during the long months of travel. She had seen cities before, the capitals of kingdoms that traded with Saba, the ancient centres of civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the ports where goods from across the world changed hands. She had thought herself prepared for whatever Solomon's capital might offer. She had been wrong. The city occupied a ridge that rose between two valleys, its position chosen by strategic minds that understood how terrain shaped defence. The walls that surrounded it were massive, constructed from stones so precisely fitted that a knife blade could not have slipped between them. Towers punctuated the walls at regular intervals, their heights commanding views across the approaches from every direction. This was not merely a city, it was a fortress, designed to withstand the sieges that the ancient world's endless conflicts inevitably brought. And yet, despite the martial architecture, the overall impression was not of grimness, but of confidence. A city secure enough in its strength to display beauty as well as power. The road leading to the main gate was crowded with traffic that spoke to the kingdom's commercial vitality. Caravans like her own, though smaller, moved goods in both directions. Farmers brought produce from the surrounding countryside. Merchants haggled with customers over prices that the Queen's trained ear recognised as reasonable by regional standards. The diversity of the crowd was striking. Faces and garments from across the ancient Near East, languages that blended into a constant hum of negotiation and greeting, the cosmopolitan, mixing that only prosperous trading centres achieved. Solomon's kingdom had become a crossroads, and Jerusalem was its beating heart. The Queen's arrival had been announced in advance by messengers who had ridden ahead of the caravan. As her column approached the gate, she could see that preparations had been made to receive her. Officials in formal garments stood waiting, their positions indicating rank in some hierarchy she did not yet understand. Guards had cleared a path through the usual traffic, creating a corridor through which her caravan could pass without the delays that ordinary travellers endured. The respect being shown was appropriate to her status, and she noted it with approval. Solomon's court understood protocol. The passage through the gate and into the city proper revealed layer upon layer of thoughtful organisation. The streets were paved, not merely packed earth, but actual stone, laid in patterns that facilitated drainage and provided stable footing for the animals and carts that used them. Buildings rose on either side in styles that showed both local tradition and foreign influence, the exchange of ideas that commerce always facilitated made visible in architecture. The smell of the city was complex, cooking food and animal dung, incense from household shrines, and the sharper scent of metalworking forges, the particular urban mixture that every city possessed but that each composed differently. The route to the palace led upward, following the ridge's spine toward its highest point. The Queen's litter-bearers maintained their steady pace, but she found herself pushing aside the curtains to see more clearly, unwilling to experience this arrival through filtered glimpses. The buildings grew larger and more impressive as they climbed. Administrative structures, she guessed. Homes of officials whose proximity to the palace reflected their importance. Gardens appeared where the wealthy had diverted water for private cultivation. green spaces that softened the stone and provided shade against the sun. Everything spoke of resources carefully deployed, of planning that extended beyond immediate necessity to encompass beauty and order. And then the palace complex itself came into view, and the Queen understood why the reports she had received had struggled to convey what they described. The structure dominated the city's highest ground, spreading across a space that would have contained a small town in less ambitious hands. Walls of white stone caught the light and reflected it back with an intensity that made the building seem almost to glow. Cedar beams, the famous cedars of Lebanon, imported at enormous expense through Solomon's alliance with King Hiram of Tyre, provided the horizontal elements, their rich red-brown colour contrasting with the white stone in patterns that pleased the eye. Gold appeared everywhere, in the capitals of columns, in the frames of doorways, in decorative elements that caught the sun and scattered it in brilliant fragments. The main entrance was flanked by pillars of such size that the Queen found herself calculating the engineering required to quarry, transport and erect them. Each pillar had been given a name, she would later learn, Jachin and Boaz, though the entrance she approached led not to the temple but to the royal residence. Lions carved from stone guarded the approach, their poses suggesting readiness to spring, their craftsmanship so skilled that the Queen half expected to see them breathe. The message was clear. Power resided here, power that could afford the finest artisans in the world and that used their skills to declare its presence to all who approached. The officials who had waited at the city gate had been joined by others of even higher rank, their garments more elaborate, their manner more formal. The Queen was helped from her litter with ceremony appropriate to the moment, her own attendants arranging her robes while Solomon's servants stood at respectful distance. Someone was speaking words of welcome in accented but competent Sabaean, a thoughtful touch that demonstrated the court's preparation for her arrival. She responded in Hebrew, which she had studied during the months of preparation, watching the slight widening of eyes that her linguistic competence produced. Let them report to Solomon that his visitor was not an unsophisticated provincial. The passage through the palace corridors revealed still more wonders that the Queen catalogued, with the methodical attention her commercial training had instilled. The floors were inlaid with patterns of coloured stone, geometric designs that led the eye forward while rewarding closer examination. The walls displayed carvings that depicted scenes from Israel's history. She recognised what must be the parting of a sea, the giving of law on a mountain, the conquest of a walled city. Tapestries hung in alcoves, their weaving so fine that the images they portrayed seemed almost to move in the light that filtered through high windows. Attendants stood at intervals along the route, their uniforms identical, their postures expressing discipline that only rigorous training could produce. The Queen noted the servants with particular care. A household's character revealed itself in how it treated those who served, and Solomon's servants appeared well-fed, well-clothed and well-organised. Their movements were efficient without being hurried. Their faces showed alertness without anxiety. They worked together with the coordination that only came from clear expectations and fair treatment. If this was a performance staged for her benefit, it was a performance that would have required years of preparation. More likely, she judged, this was simply how Solomon's household operated, a reflection of the wisdom that was said to characterize everything the king touched. The throne room, when she finally entered it, confirmed everything the approach had promised, an added dimension she had not anticipated. The space was vast, its ceiling supported by cedar columns arranged in rows that created a sense of procession, even for those who merely stood still. Light entered through clerestory windows set high in the walls, angling down in shafts that illuminated specific areas while leaving others in shadow, a design choice that directed attention where attention was meant to fall. The floor was a single expanse of polished stone, its surface so smooth that it reflected the columns and the light in the figures that moved across it. The walls displayed more carvings, more tapestries, more evidence of wealth deployed in service of beauty. And at the far end, elevated on a platform reached by stairs, stood the throne. It was made of ivory. The Queen recognised the material immediately, knew its cost, understood how many elephants had died to provide enough for a structure of this size. Gold overlay covered every surface, worked into patterns that combined Israelite motifs, with influences from Egypt and Phoenicia and places further east. 6 steps led up to the throne, and on each step stood pairs of lions, 12 in total, their golden forms positioned as guardians of whoever sat above them. The armrests were shaped as lions as well, their heads serving as the points where the king's hands would rest. Nothing in the queen's experience had prepared her for furniture that was simultaneously a work of art, a statement of power, and an expression of theological meaning. On the throne sat Solomon. He was younger than she had expected, a man in his prime rather than the aged sage she had half imagined. His face was intelligent, his eyes alert, his bearing relaxed but attentive. He wore robes of purple and gold that would have marked him as royal, even without the throne and the lions and the entire apparatus of majesty that surrounded him. But the queen found her attention drawn past these external markers to something less definable, a quality of presence, of centered attention, of a mind fully engaged with the moment it inhabited. Solomon looked at her, and she had the disconcerting sense that he was seeing not merely her appearance, but something of her essence. The formal greetings consumed time that felt simultaneously necessary and wasteful. Interpreters translated words that both monarchs largely understood without assistance. Attendants presented the queen's credentials and recited her titles. Solomon responded with welcomes that followed ancient formulas while somehow sounding fresh, as though he were discovering the courtesies for the first time rather than repeating phrases he had spoken to hundreds of other visitors. The ritual created space for both parties to observe each other, to assess what the journey and the encounter had brought together. When the formalities concluded, Solomon spoke directly to her for the first time. "I have heard of your wisdom," he said, his Hebrew clear and measured, "and of your desire for truth. I have heard that you bring questions that your own sages cannot answer. You are welcome in Jerusalem, and whatever questions you carry, I will do my best to address them." The queen felt the moment she had travelled months to reach suddenly arrive. The questions she had refined through endless hours of reflection, the riddles she'd designed to test the limits of any wisdom, the philosophical puzzles that had resisted every solution her own scholars had offered. All of it was now to be deployed against the mind that sat before her on that golden throne. She began. The first questions were testing probes, designed to assess the range and depth of Solomon's knowledge before she committed to her more challenging material. She asked about the natural world, the behaviour of animals, the properties of plants, the patterns of weather that shaped agriculture and commerce. Solomon answered without hesitation, his responses demonstrating familiarity with phenomena the queen had assumed were known only in her own region. He spoke of creatures she had never seen, and plants that did not grow in Arabia, displaying a comprehensiveness of natural knowledge that would have taken decades of study to acquire. She moved to harder ground. She posed riddles in the traditional form, questions whose surface meaning concealed deeper puzzles, verbal constructions that required lateral thinking to unravel. Solomon solved each one with an ease that seemed almost casual, explaining not just the answers but the principles that underlay them, teaching even as he demonstrated his capacity to understand. The queen found herself learning from the solutions themselves, seeing patterns she had not previously recognized, understanding why her own scholars had failed where Solomon succeeded. She escalated further. She presented the philosophical challenges she had carried from Saba, the questions about justice and knowledge, and the divine that had driven her journey in the first place. She asked how a ruler could be both just and merciful when justice and mercy seemed to demand opposite actions. She asked how anyone could know truth with certainty in a world where certainties constantly proved false. She asked about the nature of the God Solomon served and why that God permitted suffering if he possessed the power to prevent it. Solomon engaged each question with seriousness that honoured the asking. He did not dismiss the difficulties or pretend that easy answers existed for hard problems. He acknowledged the genuine tensions the queen had identified while pointing toward resolutions she had not considered. His responses wove together practical wisdom and philosophical insight, concrete examples and abstract principles, references to his own experience as ruler, and appeals to truths that transcended any particular situation. The queen found herself not merely receiving answers, but being drawn into a way of thinking that made the answers accessible. The hours passed. The light through the clerestory windows shifted from afternoon gold to evening amber. Attendants brought refreshments that neither monarch more than touched. So absorbed were they in the exchange that had developed between them. The questions continued, the answers continued, and slowly the Queen began to realise that what she was experiencing was not mere cleverness or learning, not the sophisticated performance of a king who had mastered the appearance of wisdom. What she was experiencing was the genuine article, a mind that had somehow gained access to truths that ordinary minds could not reach, an understanding that operated at a level she had not known was possible. The session concluded only when the light failed entirely and the servants lit lamps that could not sustain the intensity of engagement the day had demanded. Solomon rose from his throne, his movements showing the first signs of fatigue that the Queen had observed in him. "We will continue tomorrow," he said, "and for as many days as your questions require. You have come far seeking truth. You will not leave without finding what you sought." The Queen bowed her head in acknowledgement, but her mind was already racing ahead to what the next day would bring. She had tested Solomon with her best challenges, and he had met everyone. She had probed for weaknesses in his understanding and found none she could exploit. She had arrived prepared to discover that the reports were exaggerated, that the wisdom was merely reputation, that the journey had been a magnificent waste of time. Instead, she had discovered that the reports had not told the half of it. The king whose wisdom she had come to test possessed something she had not known existed, a depth of understanding that seemed to reach beyond human capacity toward something divine. Tomorrow she would probe further. Tomorrow she would ask about the source of what she was witnessing. Tomorrow she would learn whether this wisdom could be acquired, or whether it could only be received. The Queen retired to the chambers prepared for her, but sleep was slow in coming. Her mind kept returning to the throne room, to the man on the golden seat, to the answers that had illuminated questions she had carried for years. Something was happening inside her that she did not yet have words to describe. The search that had driven her across 1,000 miles of desert was not ending, it was intensifying. And somewhere in the palace, a king who understood things she was only beginning to glimpse prepared for a visitor whose questions had proven worthy of his attention. The days that followed took on a rhythm of their own, different from the rhythm of the journey, and different from the rhythm of the Queen's life in Saba. Each morning she rose early, prepared herself with care that had nothing to do with vanity, and made her way to whatever space Solomon had designated for their continuing conversation. Sometimes it was the throne room, with its overwhelming grandeur and its careful staging of a royal authority. More often it was a smaller chamber, intimate enough for genuine exchange, where two minds could meet without the distraction of audiences and protocol. The conversations ranged across territories the Queen had not known existed. Solomon spoke of governance, not merely the mechanics of administration, which she understood well enough from her own experience, but the principles that underlay effective rule. Justice, he explained, was not simply the application of law to circumstance. It was the discernment of what each situation truly required, the wisdom to see past surface appearances to underlying realities, the courage to render verdicts that might be unpopular, but that served the deeper good. He told her of cases he had judged, including the famous dispute between two women who both claimed the same infant, and she saw in his solutions not cleverness but insight, an ability to read human nature that seemed almost supernatural in its accuracy. He spoke of leadership and the burdens it carried. A king who sought only his own pleasure would destroy his kingdom and himself. A king who served only his people's immediate desires would fail them in their deeper needs. True leadership required holding multiple goods in tension, sacrificing lesser things for greater, accepting the loneliness that came from making decisions that others could not understand. The Queen recognized her own struggles in his descriptions, saw her own questions reflected in his analysis, and found in his words a framework that made sense of challenges she had faced without fully comprehending. He spoke of human nature, its heights and depths, its capacity for both nobility and degradation. He had observed people across every level of society, from the labourers who built his temple to the foreign dignitaries who sought his counsel. He had seen what motivated them, what they feared, what they hoped for, what led them to wisdom, and what led them to foolishness. His observations were neither cynical nor naive. He saw humanity clearly, with all its contradictions, and somehow managed to maintain both compassion for human weakness and standards that called people toward their better possibilities. The Queen found herself sharing her own experiences more than she had intended. She spoke of the challenges of ruling Saba, of the decisions that kept her awake at night, of the times she had chosen wrongly and the times she had chosen rightly without being certain which was which. Solomon listened with attention that made her feel genuinely heard, not merely tolerated by a king humouring a guest, but engaged by a fellow sovereign who understood what she faced. The exchange became mutual, a dialogue rather than an interrogation, each party learning from the other, even as the asymmetry of their wisdom remained evident. But it was when Solomon spoke of his God that the Queen's attention sharpened to its finest edge. The religions she knew were transactional arrangements. Humans offered sacrifices and observances. Gods provided protection and prosperity. The relationship was essentially commercial, obligations exchanged for benefits, rituals performed to secure outcomes. The gods themselves were powerful, but not particularly different from humans in their characters. They quarrelled among themselves, pursued petty jealousies, could be manipulated by those who understood their preferences. They were to be feared and appeased rather than loved or trusted. Solomon described something categorically different. The God of Israel was not one deity among many, competing for worshippers in a crowded marketplace of divine options. He was the only God, the creator of everything that existed, the source of all wisdom and all truth, the one from whom all other powers derived whatever authority they possessed. The gods of other nations were not rivals to be defeated, but illusions to be outgrown, shadows that would disappear when the light of true understanding finally dawned. This God had revealed himself to Israel through events that Solomon recounted with the familiarity of stories told since childhood. He had called Abraham from distant Ur and promised him descendants who would bless all nations. He had delivered those descendants from slavery in Egypt through signs and wonders that defied natural explanation. He had given them law at Sinai, not arbitrary commands but wisdom for living, a path toward human flourishing that reflected the divine nature itself. He had brought them to this land and established them as a nation, not because they were better than other peoples, but because he had chosen them for purposes that extended far beyond their own welfare. The fear of the Lord, Solomon said, is the beginning of wisdom. The phrase arrested the Queen's attention. She had heard it before in the reports that had drawn her to Jerusalem, but hearing it from Solomon's own lips gave it weight the reports had lacked. Fear did not mean terror, he explained, not the cringing of a slave before a cruel master. It meant reverence, awe, the appropriate response of a creature who recognized its creator. It meant acknowledging that human wisdom, however impressive, operated within limits that only divine wisdom could transcend. It meant understanding that the foundation of all true knowledge was not human cleverness, but humble reception of what God had revealed. This was the source of Solomon's wisdom. Not study alone, though he had studied. Not experience alone, though his experience was vast. The wisdom that had drawn the Queen across 1,000 miles of desert was a gift. Divine endowment granted in response to a prayer that Solomon had offered at the beginning of his reign. He had not asked God for wealth, or power, or victory over his enemies. He had asked for understanding to govern justly, and God had granted the request with an abundance that exceeded anything Solomon himself had imagined. The Queen sat with this claim, turning it over in her mind as she would have examined a gem of unusual quality. If Solomon was telling the truth, and everything in their days of exchange suggested that he was, then the implications were staggering. Wisdom of the kind he possessed was not a human achievement that anyone could replicate through sufficient effort. It was a divine gift that could only be received through relationship with the giver. The search for truth that had driven her from Saba was not merely an intellectual pursuit. It was a spiritual journey, and its destination was not a set of propositions, but a person. She asked Solomon about this god's character. Was he distant and indifferent, like the high gods of some traditions who created the world and then withdrew from involvement in it? Was he capricious and dangerous, like the nature spirits whose moods shifted without warning or reason? Was he partial to Israel in ways that excluded other nations from his concern? Solomon's answers painted a portrait that the Queen had not encountered in any religious tradition she had studied. The God of Israel was utterly holy, set apart from creation, different in kind from everything he had made, existing in a realm of purity that human language could only gesture toward. Yet this holy God was also intensely personal, involved with his creation at every level, aware of every sparrow that fell and every human heart that called upon him. He had chosen Israel for a purpose, but that purpose was ultimately the blessing of all nations. The wisdom that flowed from his throne was offered to anyone who sought it with genuine humility. "If any of you lacks wisdom," Solomon said, articulating a principle that would later echo through other scriptures, "let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without finding fault." The queen felt something shifting inside her as the days of conversation accumulated. She had come to Jerusalem seeking answers, and she had found them, answers more profound than she had imagined, solutions to puzzles that had resisted her best efforts for years. But she was receiving more than answers. She was receiving a new way of understanding reality itself, a framework that reoriented everything she thought she knew about wisdom and truth and the proper aim of human life. The temple became part of her education. Solomon took her to see it, walking her through the courts and explaining what each element represented. The altar where sacrifices were offered pointed to the cost of sin and the possibility of atonement. The bronze sea supported by 12 oxen spoke of purification, the cleansing that relationship with the holy God required. The holy place, where priests performed daily rituals, represented the ongoing communion between God and his people. And the Holy of Holies, that innermost chamber where the Ark of the Covenant rested beneath the wings of golden cherubim, symbolized the presence of God himself dwelling among his people. The queen was not permitted to enter the inner spaces. She was neither Israelite nor male, and the restrictions that governed access to holiness were absolute. But she stood at the boundaries and felt something that she could only describe as weight. The presence that Solomon spoke of was not merely a theological concept. It was a reality that pressed against her awareness, that made the air in the temple courts feel different from air anywhere else, that communicated without words that she was standing at the edge of something infinite. She watched Solomon worship and saw a dimension of the man she had not yet witnessed. The king who sat on an ivory throne flanked by golden lions, the ruler whose word was law throughout his realm, the mind whose wisdom had humbled her own best thinking. This man knelt in the temple courts like any other suppliant, his face turned toward the sanctuary, his prayers offered with a humility that no amount of royal dignity could mask. Solomon genuinely believed what he taught. His wisdom was not theoretical, it was lived. The fear of the Lord was not a phrase he deployed for rhetorical effect, it was the foundation of his existence. The queen found herself doing something she had not planned. In the quiet of her chambers, in the hours before dawn when the palace still slept, she addressed the God of Israel herself. The words were halting, uncertain, the prayers of someone who did not know the proper forms and was not sure she had the right to speak at all. But she spoke anyway, asking for understanding, asking for the wisdom that Solomon said was available to all who sought it, with genuine hearts. She did not know if her words were heard. She did not know if a God who had revealed himself to Israel would attend to a queen from Arabia who had grown up worshipping other deities entirely. But she asked anyway, because she'd learned that wisdom began with asking, and she had finally found something worth asking for. The days accumulated into weeks. The questions that had seemed so urgent when she arrived gradually found their answers, and new questions emerged to take their place. The queen discovered that wisdom was not a destination to be reached, but a path to be walked, not a prize to be won, but a relationship to be cultivated. Solomon was not merely a repository of information, but a guide who could point her toward the source from which his own understanding flowed. One morning, as the light through the chamber windows carried the particular quality of the early spring, the queen realized that her time in Jerusalem was approaching its end. She had received what she had come for, more than she had come for. The questions that had driven her across the desert had been answered. The search for truth had found its object. The testing of Solomon's wisdom had revealed not weakness, but depths she had not imagined possible. It was time to speak what she'd come to understand. It was time to acknowledge what these weeks had revealed. It was time to declare before the court that had received her and the king who had taught her. what the journey for truth had finally produced, the Queen of Sheba prepared to give testimony to the wisdom she had found, and to the God from whom that wisdom flowed. The throne room had been prepared for a formal audience, the kind of ceremonial occasion that both courts understood and both cultures practiced with their own variations on ancient themes. The Queen had requested this setting deliberately. What she was about to say needed witnesses, needed the weight of official context, needed to be spoken not as private conversation but as public declaration. The words she carried had been forming throughout her weeks in Jerusalem, crystallizing slowly as understanding deepened, and now they pressed for expression with an urgency she could no longer defer. Solomon sat upon his golden throne, the lions at rest beside him, his court arrayed in tiers of diminishing rank that spread outward from the royal presence, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The Queen's own attendants stood nearby, their faces showing the mixture of curiosity and pride that the occasion warranted. The Sabaean officials who had accompanied her across the desert were about to witness their sovereign deliver a verdict on the wisdom they had travelled so far to test. Whatever she said would be carried back to their homeland and repeated for generations. The Queen approached the throne with the measured dignity that her position required, her robes catching the light that angled down from the clear-story windows, her bearing communicating respect without subservience. She had come as an equal seeking truth, and she would speak as an equal who had found it. The protocols of greeting unfolded, bows exchanged, formal phrases pronounced, the ritual choreography that allowed strangers to meet and sovereigns to acknowledge one another without the friction that unmediated encounter might produce. Then she spoke, and the words she chose would echo through millennia of scripture and story. "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the throne room. "But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes." She paused, allowing the acknowledgement to register. She had doubted. She had been skeptical. She had assumed that the reports reaching Saba were exaggerated, inflated by admirers and distorted by distance. She had come prepared to find less than she had been promised, to discover that Solomon's reputation exceeded his reality. This confession of prior disbelief made what followed all the more powerful. "Indeed, not even half was told me." The phrase landed with the impact she intended. Not even half. The reports that had seemed too extravagant to credit had actually understated the truth. The wisdom she had heard described in superlative terms had proven even greater than those terms could capture. Whatever she had imagined during the long months of travel, whatever expectations she had formed based on the accounts of merchants and travellers, the reality surpassed them all. "Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the report I heard," she continued, her words painting a picture of what her time in Jerusalem had revealed. She spoke of the officials who served Solomon, the organisation of his household, the quality of the food at his table, the excellence of his attendants. She noted the skill with which the kingdom was administered, the justice that characterised its courts, the prosperity that flowed from wise governance. These were the external signs, the visible evidence of something invisible, the wisdom that ordered everything and made everything work. But she did not stop with administration and prosperity. The Queen's declaration reached toward something deeper, something that the weeks of conversation had slowly revealed. "Happy are your officials, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom." The happiness she described was not the shallow contentment of servants well paid and well fed. It was the privilege of proximity to genuine wisdom, the benefit of hearing truth from someone who actually understood it, the transformation that came from exposure to a mind illuminated by divine light. To stand in Solomon's presence was not merely to serve a powerful king, it was to receive an education in reality itself. The Queen had experienced this happiness during her own weeks of standing before him, and she testified to what she had received. Then came the words that revealed the full depth of her understanding, the recognition that had been building since her first day in the throne room and that now demanded public expression. "Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel." She was not praising Solomon. She was praising Solomon's God, the wisdom she had encountered, the understanding that had answered her hardest questions, the truth she had found at the end of her 1,000-mile journey. None of it was Solomon's personal achievement. All of it flowed from the God who had chosen Solomon, gifted Solomon, placed Solomon on his throne for purposes that extended beyond any individual reign. The Queen of Sheba, raised in a land of different deities, educated in religious traditions that bore no resemblance to Israel's faith, stood in a foreign throne room and blessed the name of a God she was only beginning to know. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness. The declaration completed itself with this acknowledgement of purpose. Solomon's wisdom was not an end in itself. It was not granted so that the king might impress visitors, or win debates, or accumulate a reputation for brilliance. It was granted for a reason, to maintain justice and righteousness, to govern in accordance with the divine character, to serve as an instrument of God's love for his people. The wisdom that had drawn the queen across the desert was ultimately not about Solomon at all. It was about the God who gave wisdom and the purposes for which wisdom was given. The throne room held silence for a moment after she finished speaking, the weight of her words settling over the assembled court. She'd come to test Solomon's wisdom and had ended by praising Solomon's God. She had arrived as a seeker of truth and had become a witness to the source of truth. The transformation was complete, and she had declared it publicly, binding herself to the testimony by speaking it before witnesses who would remember. Then came the presentation of the gifts she had carried from Sheba, the tribute that had been prepared with such care during the months before departure. Servants brought forward the containers of carved alabaster, their seals broken to reveal the contents within. The frankincense and myrrh perfumed the throne room with scents that spoke of her homeland, the finest aromatics that Sabaean groves produced, quality that even Solomon's experienced court recognized as exceptional. The spices followed, cinnamon and cassia and varieties that the chroniclers could only call great quantities, more than had ever come to Israel from a single source. The gold came next, talents beyond counting displayed in vessels whose craftsmanship demonstrated what Sabaean artisans could achieve. 120 talents, the records would later specify, a fortune that would have financed armies or built cities, offered now as tribute to a wisdom that transcended any material value. The queen had prepared these gifts to honour a reputation. She gave them now to honour a reality that exceeded the reputation by unmeasurable degrees. The precious stones followed, gems selected from collections that had taken generations to accumulate, each piece chosen for its unique beauty, each stone representing the wealth of a kingdom laid at the feet of a wisdom that had proven itself beyond any possibility of doubt. The queen held nothing back. The gifts that had seemed so carefully calculated during the months of preparation now seemed almost insufficient. The best she could offer still inadequate to acknowledge what she'd received. Solomon received the tribute with grace that matched the giving. He did not gloat over the wealth now added to his treasury, or treat the gifts as mere transactions in the economy of royal exchange. He understood what the queen was expressing, not political alliance or commercial arrangement, but gratitude for something that could not be purchased at any price. The gifts were symbols, material signs of an immaterial transformation, and Solomon received them as such. Then came his response, and it demonstrated the generosity that wisdom produced in those who genuinely possessed it. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. The phrase captured something essential about the exchange. Solomon did not merely match her gifts with equivalent value, as diplomatic protocol might have required. He gave her what she desired, the wisdom she had sought, the understanding she had lacked, the answers to questions that had driven her across 1,000 miles. These were the gifts that mattered, and they could not be quantified or displayed like gold and gems. But beyond these intangible treasures, Solomon added material gifts from his own stores, demonstrations of his regard for a visitor whose questions had proven worthy and whose transformation had been genuine. The chroniclers do not specify what Solomon gave her, leaving later generations to imagine the treasures that might have passed from Israel's king to Sheba's queen. Fine fabrics, perhaps, the linens and wools that Israel's trade networks made available, worked metals that demonstrated skills different from but equal to Sabaean craftsmanship, goods from the far reaches of Solomon's commercial empire, products of lands that Sheba's own traders had never reached. Whatever the specific items, the giving was generous beyond requirement, a reflection of the giver's character rather than a calculation of reciprocal obligation, but the greatest gift had already been given, and both monarchs knew it. The queen had received what she had come for, truth that was actually true, wisdom that reached beyond human capacity, understanding of a God whose reality she had not previously imagined. These gifts would return with her to Saba, and would shape her reign in ways that material treasures never could. She had found what she was looking for, and having found it, everything else took its proper place as secondary. The formal audience concluded with the ceremonies that such occasions required: final exchanges of blessing, statements of mutual regard, expressions of hope that the friendship established would endure across the years and the miles. The courts of both kingdoms witnessed the conclusion of a visit that had begun in skepticism and ended in testimony, that had tested wisdom and found it genuine, that had sought truth and discovered not merely information but the source of all genuine knowledge. The queen withdrew to her quarters to begin the preparations for departure. The caravan that had brought her north would carry her south again, through the same territories and along the same routes, but everything about the journey would be different. She was not the same woman who had left Saba months ago. The questions that had driven her had been answered. The hunger that had propelled her across the desert had been fed. She was returning home not empty-handed but transformed, carrying within herself something more valuable than all the gold she had given and all the treasures she had received. In the quiet of her chambers, she reflected on what had happened to her in Jerusalem. She had come seeking wisdom, and had found the wise one behind all wisdom. She had come testing a king, and had encountered the king whom that king served. She had come with questions about truth, and had discovered that truth was not a proposition to be grasped, but a person to be known. The God of Israel, the God who gave wisdom to those who asked, who placed kings on thrones to maintain justice, who loved his people with an eternal love. This God had become real to her in ways she was still struggling to comprehend. She did not know what this would mean for her kingdom. She did not know how the wisdom she had received would translate into the challenges that awaited her return. She did not know whether her people would understand what she had experienced, or whether they would see only that their queen had travelled far and returned with stories of a foreign king. These questions belonged to the future, and the future would unfold in its own time. For now, it was enough to know that she had found what she was looking for. For now, it was enough to have spoken her testimony in Solomon's court, and to have blessed the God whose wisdom had answered her deepest questions. For now, it was enough to prepare for the journey home, carrying within her a treasure that no thief could steal, and no distance could diminish. The Queen of Sheba had come to Jerusalem seeking truth. She had found it, and she had been found by the one who was truth itself. The caravan departed Jerusalem on a morning bright with spring sunshine, the same column of camels and servants and guards that had arrived months before, now laden with different cargo and carrying a queen who had been transformed by what she had encountered. The city walls receded behind her as the road descended toward the valleys that would lead eventually to the desert routes of home. The queen looked back once, twice, watching the white and gold of Solomon's capital grow smaller against the ridge until a turning in the road hid it from view entirely. She was not sure she would ever see Jerusalem again. She was certain she would never forget it. The journey south unfolded with the same rhythms that had governed the journey north: the early morning departures, the midday rests, the evening camps beneath stars that wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. But the Queen experienced these familiar rhythms differently now. The desert that had seemed harsh and demanding on the outward journey now appeared in a different light, its vastness speaking not of emptiness, but of the creative power that had shaped it. The stars that had provided navigation now reminded her of Solomon's words about the God who had flung them into space and called each one by name. The world itself had not changed, but her way of seeing it had been revolutionized. She spent the travelling hours in reflection, processing what she had experienced in Jerusalem and considering what it would mean for her return to Saba. The wisdom she had received was not merely a collection of insights to be filed away for occasional reference. It was a framework for understanding everything: governance and justice, human nature and divine purpose, the proper ordering of life both individual and collective. She found herself revisiting decisions she had made before her departure, seeing them now through the lens of what Solomon had taught her, recognizing where she had chosen wisely and where she had fallen short. The advisors who travelled with her noticed the change, but did not always know how to interpret it. Their queen had always been thoughtful, always been given to reflection and careful judgment. But there was something different now, a quality of settled confidence that had not been present before, a groundedness that seemed to arise from sources deeper than political calculation or commercial acumen. When they discussed matters of governance during the evening hours, she responded with perspectives they had not heard from her before, considerations of justice that went beyond mere legality, insights into human motivation that revealed dimensions they had not considered, references to principles that she attributed to Solomon, but that seemed to flow from somewhere beyond even his wisdom. The queen began to share with them, slowly at first and then with increasing openness, what she had learned in Jerusalem. She spoke of Solomon's understanding of leadership and justice, his observations about human nature, his methods for discerning truth from falsehood. These teachings found receptive ears among advisors who had wondered what their sovereign had discovered during her long sojourn in the foreign capital. But when she spoke of Solomon's God, the one who had given him wisdom, the creator who stood behind all created things, the divine source from which true understanding flowed, she sensed a different quality of attention, a mixture of fascination and uncertainty that reflected the strangeness of what she was describing. She did not press the matter. The transformation she had experienced could not be transferred through argumentation or imposed through royal authority. It had come through encounter, through weeks of conversation and observation, through the gradual opening of her mind to realities she had not previously known existed. If her advisors were to experience something similar, it would happen in its own time and through its own means. Her task was not to convert them, but to govern wisely with the understanding she had received, letting the fruits of wisdom speak for themselves. The return to Sheba brought the complication she had anticipated. The kingdom had continued to function in her absence. The regents she had appointed had proven competent, and no crises had erupted to threaten stability. But her return was not seamless. Relationships had shifted during the months she'd been away. Alliances had formed that had not existed before her departure. The court that had seemed so familiar before her journey now felt slightly foreign, as though she was seeing it for the first time through eyes that had learned to see differently. She addressed her full court within days of her return, giving a formal account of her journey that balanced diplomatic discretion with genuine testimony. She spoke of Solomon's wisdom and the questions he'd answered. She described the temple and the palace, the organization of his kingdom, the justice that characterized his courts. She recounted her own declaration in his throne room, the acknowledgement that not even half had been told her, the praise she had offered to the God who had made Solomon king. The court listened with the attention due a royal address, and the queen watched their faces for signs of comprehension or resistance. The impact of her testimony spread outward from the court in ripples that would continue expanding for generations. Merchants who traded with northern kingdoms began incorporating references to Solomon's wisdom into their accounts of the wider world. Scholars who studied foreign traditions added Israel's faith to their catalogues of religious thought, now viewing it with greater seriousness than they had before their queen's endorsement. The God of Israel did not displace Sheba's native deities overnight. Religious transformation moved slowly, and the queen did not attempt to accelerate it through royal decree. But something had shifted in the cultural atmosphere. A door had been opened that had not been opened before. The queen governed differently in the years that followed, though the changes were subtle enough that only careful observers recognized them. She showed greater concern for justice in her courts, ensuring that the poor and vulnerable received fair treatment rather than being ground down by the machinery of power. She administered her realm with attention to principles that transcended mere efficiency or profitability. She sought wisdom before making major decisions, and those who knew her well suspected that the seeking sometimes took the form of prayer addressed to a God whose existence she had discovered in Jerusalem. Whether she ever returned to Israel, the chroniclers do not say. Whether she maintained correspondence with Solomon across the hundreds of miles that separated their kingdoms, we do not know. The biblical narrative closes her story with the exchange of gifts and her departure for home, leaving everything that followed to imagination and tradition. Ethiopian legends would later claim that she bore Solomon a son who founded a royal dynasty that traced its lineage through 3,000 years of history. Arabian traditions would remember her as a wise queen who sought truth and found it. The details varied, but the core of the story remained constant. A woman had travelled to the ends of the earth in search of wisdom and had not been disappointed. Centuries passed. The kingdom of Sheba rose and fell, its great dam eventually collapsing, its cities declining into ruins that later archaeologists would excavate and study. Solomon's kingdom divided after his death, the northern tribes splitting away to form a separate nation that would eventually be conquered and scattered. Jerusalem itself fell to Babylonian armies, its temple destroyed, its people carried into exile. The world the queen had travelled through transformed beyond recognition, empires rising and falling, trade routes shifting, the ancient patterns of commerce and power giving way to new configurations that no one in her era could have imagined. But her story survived. It passed from generation to generation through the scriptures that Israel preserved, through the traditions that other cultures maintained, through the collective memory of peoples who found in her journey something worth remembering. She became a symbol of the sincere search for truth, of the willingness to travel far and risk much in pursuit of wisdom, of the reward that awaited those who sought understanding with genuine hearts. And then, centuries after her death, her story received an interpretation that elevated it beyond mere historical memory into something approaching eternal significance. A teacher from Galilee, speaking to crowds who demanded signs and wonders before they would believe, invoked the Queen of Sheba as a witness against their unbelief. The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, he declared, for she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here. The words reframed her entire journey. She had travelled 1,000 miles to hear human wisdom, however divinely gifted. The people Jesus addressed had God himself walking among them in human flesh and could not be bothered to listen. She had sought truth across desert and mountain, risking her kingdom and her comfort for the chance to encounter genuine understanding. They had truth standing before them in the streets of their own villages and demanded entertainment before they would pay attention. Her seeking condemned their indifference. Her journey exposed their immobility. Her hunger for wisdom revealed their satisfaction with foolishness. Jesus' reference transformed the Queen of Sheba from a historical figure into an eschatological witness, someone whose example would testify at the final judgment against all who had been given greater opportunities than she had received and had squandered them through complacency or unbelief. She had responded to rumours of wisdom with a journey that consumed months and cost fortunes. What excuse could anyone offer who had been given direct access to divine truth and had yawned? The challenge her story posed extended far beyond its original audience. Every generation since has faced the same question her journey implicitly asked. What is truth worth to you? How far would you travel to find it? What would you risk? What would you sacrifice? What would you give to encounter genuine wisdom rather than settling for the comfortable illusions that surround you? The Queen of Sheba had answered those questions with her actions. She had liquidated royal treasuries to fund her expedition. She had left her kingdom in others' hands for the better part of a year. She had crossed deserts that killed less determined travellers. She had done all of this for the possibility, not the certainty, merely the possibility, that the reports she had heard were true, and that wisdom worth having actually existed in the world. Her journey was an act of faith before it was a voyage of discovery, a commitment to seeking before it was a celebration of finding, and she had found what she sought. Not merely the clever answers of a clever king, but the source of all wisdom in the God who gave it. Not merely solutions to the riddles she had carried from Sheba, but a reorientation of her entire understanding of reality. Not merely information to be catalogued and filed, but transformation that reshaped how she saw everything else. The search had been worth it. The journey had been justified. The risk had been rewarded beyond anything she'd imagined when she first conceived the expedition. Her story stands as invitation and challenge to all who encounter it. The invitation is to seek, to acknowledge the questions that trouble us, to admit the hunger that drives us, to pursue truth wherever it might be, found rather than settling for the familiar satisfactions that leave the deepest needs unaddressed. The challenge is to act on what we discover, to let the truth we find transform us rather than merely inform us, to allow wisdom to reshape our lives rather than simply decorating our conversations. The God whom the Queen discovered in Jerusalem remains the same God today, still offering wisdom to those who ask, still revealing himself to those who seek, still rewarding the humble hearts that approach him with genuine desire for understanding. The journey for truth that she undertook is still available to anyone willing to embark on it. The destination she reached is still accessible to anyone willing to travel toward it. She came from the ends of the earth to hear Solomon's wisdom. She found more than Solomon. She found the God whose wisdom Solomon merely reflected. She returned to her kingdom changed, and her story has been changing others ever since. The Queen of Sheba's journey ended centuries ago, but the invitation it represents has never been withdrawn. Truth is still worth seeking. Wisdom still rewards those who pursue it, and the God who answered her question still waits for all who will come to him with questions of their own. Her caravan has long since vanished into the sands of history, but the path she walked, the path of sincere seeking, of humble asking, of a willingness to travel far for what matters most, that path remains open to any who will take it. The journey for truth continues, and for those who undertake it with the earnestness she displayed, the same discovery awaits. Something greater than Solomon is here, and he still welcomes all who come seeking what only he can give.